All right, we're live for the 96th installment of Playing to Win. Back with my friend George Gammon. How you doing, George?
I'm doing awesome, Rich. Thanks for having me back.
It's been a while. I like to talk to you publicly at least once or twice a year about what's going on in the world from your angle because I have a hard time keeping up on all your content on your channel. And so many things are going on, developing and changing. And you've got some really good and some interesting takes on economics, different levels of economics, what's going on with the markets, and even stuff outside of that, man. Like you're a car guy too. We were talking before we went live about this road trip that you're going to do, sort of working with. Is it with crypto only down through South America?
No, we're going to try to use Bitcoin, gold, silver. And then if we
Bitcoin,
have
gold,
to,
silver. Okay.
cash. But the whole thing is called a CBDC Road Trip to Freedom Challenge.
Yeah, let's start
And
with that. Let's talk about that.
yeah, the reason I'm doing it is because I believe that the question of CBDCs is a matter of when, not if.
Yeah.
In fact, just yesterday, I saw an article on Reuters talking about how SWIFT, the payment mechanism, is coming out with a platform for central bank digital currencies within the next 12 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something, and you know what was funny, Rich, is when I first started talking about this back in 2019, when I started my channel, everybody was calling me a tinfoil hatter. They're calling me doom and gloom. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, Alex Jones, whatever. A central bank digital currency.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now all of a sudden, based on that Reuters article, 90% of central banks are in the process of building a CBDC.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a problem on a lot of different levels.
Is this a bank issued problem or is this a federal government issued problem that we're sort of?
Well, as far as from a standpoint of the citizen, the real problem is it's centralizing the ledger, and therefore they're going to have the ability to see in real time and therefore control your transactions. And then that leads to what I would call a social score.
Yeah.
And this is where, it goes into complete Big Brother and 1984 Orwell.
Yeah. So programmable money is very easy to, I guess, create, program, distribute on a blockchain ledger. You don't have to mail it. There's no checks. There's no deposit in a bank account. It can just be added to somebody's digital wallet, and they can be forced to spend the money within a certain time frame. They can be restricted on what they can spend the money on. Their ability to access it could be restricted, dependent. I mean, if we ended up in a dystopian sort of space where it's like carbon credits are a thing, and you've driven your diesel dually truck too far in the last few
or your
weeks.
McLaren.
Yeah, or your McLaren, or your Porsche, whatever happen to be, driving. We're going to restrict your access to, I don't know, maybe meat protein, and here's a bag of crickets when you check out at the grocery counter. So it goes well beyond just, the basic Orwellian stuff. Like there's a deep rabbit hole here, isn't it? It's a pretty slippery slope.
Yeah, and they can also control the extension of credit. Functionally, the way you just described it is accurate. Mechanically, it's a little bit different because the one ledger, the consolidation of the ledger, would, in my view, be the Federal Reserve's balance sheet because it's infinite. And then when we get into credit or the extension of credit, they can give anyone any interest rate they want, and they can give anyone a loan, and they don't have to worry about being paid back because they can't go bust. So right now, I don't know who you bank with, but let's say your viewers bank with Wells Fargo in the United States or Bank of America. Well, your dollars that you would consider your asset, whether it's in a checking account or a savings account, is a liability of that bank. So what would happen in a CBDC world, those dollar liabilities would go from the bank's balance sheet over to the Federal Reserve. And then since they cannot go bust, they can go ahead and give XYZ disadvantaged group home loans at 0% interest rates or negative interest rates. And if you're a straight white male like Rich Cooper, and if you've been successful in life because of your white male privilege, then you're not going to get a loan. And if you do get a loan, it's going to be at a 20 or 25% interest rate, because that's the only way that we can equal the playing field between you and this disadvantaged group that hasn't had the same, we'll call them opportunities that you have. And so this is where it gets really crazy as far as individual monetary policy. And then to your earlier point, if you're doing something they don't like, they can go ahead and put a cap on that. Or if you're not spending money fast enough, they can go ahead and have like a negative interest rate to where you have to spend that money, or you start to lose the the nominal purchasing power, or you just, at the end of the month, it just gets cut in half. So you got to spend it now or lose it. And this is the type of world that I think we're going into. You got to ask yourself, why wouldn't they do this?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Right? Like you have to assume that the more we centralize government, the more power the central planners have, the more it's going to attract people who have an insatiable lust for power. In other words, the more it's going to attract sociopaths. Now, even if you like the guy or gal in charge right now, that's not the point. At some time in the future, as long as we continue to consolidate power, then you're going to get a megalomaniac, a Stalin type, or a Mao, or other people that I can't mention to keep it YouTube friendly. You're going to get one of those people in charge. And then what they're going to do is they're going to leverage the system that has been created for them in order to control your life. And this is just the reality of the situation. That's why the only solution for this is smaller government. It's not just changing the views of the politicians and the government we have right now. So unfortunately, I've got some good news and bad news. The bad news is, for most people, this is unavoidable. You're going to have to operate within this system, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to have a bank account, or at least a bank account that's going to be compatible with you getting a paycheck, or you paying rent, or you paying your kids tuition, or buying health insurance, something like that. The good news is I think we're going to be able to initially have a hybrid system where things like Bitcoin, gold, silver allow you to check out of the system and buy some of those things that could negatively impact your social score. And that's what this CBDC Road Trip to Freedom Challenge is all about. I'm going from Santiago, Chile, driving to Buenos Aires to meet my good friend Doug Casey for this trip, for this challenge. I'm sorry?
What's the distance? How many miles?
I don't know. It's going to take us about a week. That's all I know.
Okay, you're talking a few thousand then.
Oh yeah. It's like if we were to drive straight through, it's like 20 hours.
So like food, gas, accommodation, you're paying for with gold, silver, or Bitcoin only.
We're going to try, and I think what's going to happen is we're going to get.
If they don't take it.
Yeah, then we go down to the local goldsmith, or the local gold dealer or pawn shop, and we say, look, we've got 1/10 of an ounce of gold here. How much will you give us? And then we take the cash, the hard currency, and then we go to the gas station and fill up. Now, if we can, we're going to first and foremost use the gold, silver, or Bitcoin. But I'm trying to be optimistic, but I want to be a realist at the same time. And I have my doubts that we're going to be going through these certain cities in Argentina, and we're going to be able to find a hotel that takes Bitcoin, gold, or silver. So that's kind of the game plan. And the reason I'm doing this, Rich, is to show people what it would take to operate and transact outside of the system, so people can start to prepare for that now. They can understand the realities of the situation. They can sit back and say, okay, what do I buy monthly? I buy X amount of gas. I buy X amount of beef. I buy X amount of whiskey, whatever it is, X amount of bullets, X amount of guns. And I know that this is most likely going to negatively impact my social score, which in the real world, people say, oh, well, they can pound sand. Okay, but that social score, I think moving forward, is going to replace a credit score. So if you want to get a house, if you want to provide for your family, if you need credit for your business, then you're going to have to play by these rules, right? Or you can go live like the Amish, and that's fine. And I think that would be respectable. But you have to understand that that's going to be lowering your standard of living substantially. So you have this hybrid model where I think people are going to earn money within the system. They hopefully take their savings at the end of the month, and then they transfer that into something that is outside of the system. And then they transact as much as possible outside of the system, keep a lot of their savings outside of the system. And that's how we buy time in order for this alternative ecosystem to really grow and get to a point where we can start increasing the percentage of our expenses that are paid for in whatever we want, something that's outside of just government fiat.
So what's the vehicle of choice for this road trip?
Oh, well, here's the problem with that. Initially, I wanted to go from Medellin all the way down to Buenos Aires and stop and take the Pan American Highway.
Yeah, that's when I caught wind of it. I thought it was an entire South American trip.
Yeah, I was super stoked about it. Unfortunately, they've got a lot of problems right now in Ecuador.
Okay.
And as far as violence and just, it's not a place where you want to be.
Okay.
So I tried to figure out a way around, and it just logistically, it's basically impossible. So then I was going to buy a car and I was going to have it transported back. But once we talked to the companies, we found that taking it across borders is very difficult, if not impossible. And it might take a year or something like that to get the car, and it's cost prohibitive. So the conclusion we came to is, okay, we got to rent a car. And the good thing about Chile is, since it borders Argentina, the rental car companies actually allow you to take it across the border and back. So bottom line, we had hoped to get a really super cool car that would be kind of like a, excuse me, like an off-road type vehicle that you'd see. What do they call them nowadays? They're very trendy.
Overlanders.
There you go. Yeah. Overlanders. That's what I was hoping for. But unfortunately, we're going to have to settle for like a Hyundai Santa Fe or
right.
or something like that.
Are you going to be able to rent the car with gold, Bitcoin, or silver?
No, there's no way. So we're going to get there. In fact, this Sunday.
You failed the test before you even began it.
Well, you got to cut me some slack here. Right. What's important, Rich, are the concepts.
So it's after you get the keys and it's go.
Yeah, it's actually Monday morning. So we get there this Sunday, March 31st. And Josh, my assistant, we're going to get the car. We're going to get a hotel. And then Monday morning, that's when we hit the ground running.
Okay. Are you going to keep any cash reserves on you, or it's strictly silver, gold, Bitcoin? You go to a gas station, you approach the attendant. Hey, I need to fill up. I have gold, silver, or Bitcoin. You don't take that. Then you find a pawn shop, and then you go deal with it from there.
Yeah, or I think another main takeaway that I think we'll find from this trip is, although I love gold and silver, for this type of thing, Bitcoin is vastly superior.
It's easier, yeah. It's easier to divide it, for sure.
Yeah, the problem right now with Bitcoin is the volatility, and we can get into that later, because I think the mechanics behind pretty much all asset classes right now, except for treasuries, is going to lead to more and more volatility. I call it a volatility super cycle. But anyway, getting back to that, there's a lot of Bitcoin cafes that I pulled up on the map that are on our route. So that's going to be probably the first thing we'll try if we need actual hard currency, is going to a Bitcoin cafe, then just do a peer-to-peer transaction.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Are you guys going to film this? Is it going to turn this into a vlog, or?
Oh yeah, hell yeah, absolutely.
You might as well,
yeah, we're going to be live streaming like pretty much everything, and then we're going to take the footage.
YouTube or
yeah, on the Rebel Capitalist channel on YouTube.
Okay, all right, interesting. Okay, so keep.
And we actually have a caravan, so I put it out there, and I told anyone that follows me on Twitter or my YouTube channel that if they want, they can join us. So I said, if you want to join us, just DM my assistant Josh, and not that you can ride in the car with us, a lot of luggage, but you can follow us for the whole trip, or you can follow us and be a part of it just for maybe one leg of the trip. Or I know a lot of people are going to meet us in Buenos Aires when we actually meet up with Doug Casey, who in this trip represents freedom. And so I don't know how it's going to turn out. We had a lot of people DM Josh, so we could have like a caravan of 10, 20, 30 cars going down the highway making this trip.
Speaking of Argentina, what do you think of the new president there?
I think he's great. I mean, philosophically, I'm right in line. He's got an uphill battle, obviously.
What about that press piece that was out on Twitter the other day where they were talking about him authorizing funds for like the Transformer Rainbow crowd?
Yeah, look, no one's perfect, and I'm not going to be completely in line with any political candidate. Do I think he's better than everyone else? Yeah. Do I think that he's a panacea or perfect? Absolutely not. But a lot of that, I would have to look into the details, because even if he's approving that, a lot of times that can be in a bill where the overall bill is on net balance as a positive, and he just has to include that just to appease the other politicians. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm just saying that could be. So I'd want to look into the details there further.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that he's going to do and behave as he held out to the public before he was elected. But that was a bit of a disappointment, if I'm being honest, when I read that. I don't know what what the context was around it, but it might have been money that was promised prior to him being put into power that he couldn't detour somewhere else. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on your travels through Argentina when you sort of get through there and what it's really like these days.
Yeah, another thing that I'm going to be focusing on is Argentina for a plan B. And I think everybody should be thinking about that right now. That's prior to hitting the record button or going live. You and I were talking about some of the groups that I've met with over the past couple weeks all around the world that are really trying to figure out how we not only maintain but increase the level of freedom and personal liberty that we have in the world today. And one of the conclusions that everybody was talking about, one of the main takeaways that I think can be some actionable advice for your audience, is you have to have a line in the sand. And that has to be premeditated, because at the end of the day, we're all emotional creatures. And I mean, 2020 is a perfect example where the government locked us in a cage, for heaven's sakes. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people said, well, it's okay. They make excuses for it and they rationalize as to why that's okay. But if you have a specific line in the sand, this is premeditated, then you have a game plan that you're going to execute. You take the emotion outside of the decision-making process. So as an example, my line in the sand back in 2021 were the mandates. We'll just call them the medicine mandates, just to keep it YouTube friendly here. Mm-hmm. So once the government crossed that line, I'm out. I'm done. I didn't need to think about it. It's just, bam, you take action. Mm-hmm. And I think regardless of whether you're in crypto, whether you're in gold or silver or whatever it is, and you're sitting there patting yourself on the back, and you're saying, well, I can sleep well at night knowing that I have no counterparty risk. Well, actually, you do. You still do have a lot of political risk, because I don't care how much Bitcoin you have, the government can come in and just take your passport.
Right.
And so you need to start thinking about these things. And the great thing about a plan B is there's absolutely no downside to having one. Because if you never need it, well, fine. Now you've just got a bank account in another country. You might have another passport. You might have another residency. And you've got maybe some real estate. You got a great place to vacation, whatever it is. But if you do have to use it, and if the government does cross that line, then bam, you're not going to have to sacrifice your freedom or the freedom of those people around you that you love.
Yeah, they didn't take anybody's passport during that time, but they certainly restricted your movement because of certain, that they wanted you to take to hop on a flight.
Yeah, look what they did to the truckers in Canada.
Yeah.
I mean,
you got multiple passports?
Goodness gracious. Sorry?
You've got multiple passports?
Almost. I've had an investor visa in Colombia for almost, I'm about 2 months shy of 5 years. And once we hit the 5-year mark, then I'm eligible for my Colombian passport. So I'll have both the Colombian passport and the U.S. passport. And then, of course, I've had residency here for the last 5 years or so.
Mm. Where are you right now?
In Medellin.
Yeah, I've got a lot of people lately that have been visiting, building, acquiring rental properties, Airbnb type of properties acquiring multiple passports over the last few years. Colombia is certainly one of the hotspots in South America. So why is Colombia popular versus other South American countries right now?
Well, if I'm being honest, Rich, it's probably the women.
Okay.
It's everything you read online about Colombian women is true. I can verify that. And so
as far as femininity, attractiveness, stuff like that, there's still women though, right? Like they're not like, there's no women there that are not hypergamous. There's no women there that are not solipsistic, for example. Right?
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if you read, Rollo or watch your stuff, all the hardwiring that you guys talk about
the firmware
is definitely applicable. It's going to be applicable everywhere because it's just basic evolution. It's human psychology. So you're not going to get around that. But as far as, let's say, the way the gals present themselves, the way they look, the curviness, if you will. I'm trying to forgot a way to say that in a politically correct way.
Lips, hips, and it's.
There you go. There you go. There you go. Yeah, you're going to have as much as you can handle, if not more, coming down, especially here.
You don't get that in Argentina, Chile, Brazil?
So you might. I haven't been there, but I'll definitely let you know. When I go, I'll DM you. I'll text you, Rich, and let you know how the gals are down in Argentina. But I would be very surprised because they have a much different culture down there.
Right.
And I think a lot of the culture here in, especially Medellin, is a result of kind of the narcos. Okay. And so that's still ingrained in the psyche here with the men and the women. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see some of the shapes down here that you might not see in the United States or in Argentina.
Shapes. Let me throw the super chat out because it kind of relates to the CBDCs you were just talking about. Should we expect a manufacturer crisis to shoehorn CBDC as a Trojan horse as liquidity freezes up and they present free money as a solution? What percentage of your net worth you have, Gammon, in crypto, precious metals, cash?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And I think what we have to understand is this is all an unknown, and there's going to be cross currents that are at play constantly. So when he's talking about liquidity, I mean, I could argue how there would be more liquidity just because now everything's on the Fed's balance sheet, and you would have the repo market as an example. That could be exclusively on the Fed's balance sheet. You could argue how that would increase liquidity, and you could also argue how that would decrease liquidity, because right now that service, if you will, or that market is really controlled by the Eurodollar system. In other words, the free market. So the bottom line here is, as they move toward this system, they're going to break a lot of eggs, and there's going to be huge opportunities. That's for sure, because the bigger the crisis, the bigger the opportunity. But the world is going to change. The monetary system is going to change. And I don't know how centralizing the monetary system will make it more efficient. Unfortunately, on net balance, even when you take away the Big Brother stuff and the 1984 stuff, I think it's going to be a negative. Although I must be fair, a CBDC will have a lot of features that the average Joe and Jane will love. And this is one of the reasons why I think it'll have such a high adoption rate, even if it was voluntary. Because number one, your bank can't go bust. And what we've seen with Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, Signature, Credit Suisse, New York Community Bank, a lot of these entities that are holding your dollars, or your dollars are a liability of these entities, can go bust. So I think the pitch is going to be, why not move them to the one balance sheet that can't go bust? That would be the Federal Reserve. And they'll be able to pay you a much higher interest rate. Rich, I don't know what you're getting right now in your checking account or your savings, but I would be shocked if it was over maybe 2 or 3%. So why not get the exact same interest rate that the Federal Reserve is paying Jamie Dimon? And that's interest on reserves is what they call it. And without getting technical, it's basically JP Morgan's checking account held at the Fed, and they're getting 5.25%. So how many of your viewers right now are getting 5.25% on their checking account? Probably very few. So that's going to be another feature. You're going to be able to settle transactions instantly. You're probably going to be able to exchange dollars for pesos or whatever it is, Mexican pesos, or Canadian dollars, probably free, because that's just absorbed by the Fed's balance sheet. So this is what we have to look out for. And, you know, a lot of people don't like to acknowledge the fact that they're going to have these features with the CBDC. But to me, that's like going in and fighting John Jones and not doing any homework. You have to acknowledge his strengths. And then you also have to be realistic about those strengths and the weaknesses. And that's the only way that you're going to have any chance of not just defeating John Jones, but in that case, probably surviving. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's the exact same thing. We're up against Goliath. We have to realize that. And so we've got to take it seriously. We need to understand that most of the normies out there will gravitate toward a CBDC like a moth to a flame, because the argument there
will, for sure.
Yeah, the argument is that once people get a social score, or once they call it a CBDC, the public is going to kind of retract from that, and they're not going to call it a CBDC. Rich, why would they do that?
Going to be to suck them in? Is it going to be like sign up now and get $50 free or something like that?
Yeah, they're going to be like, look, your bank's going bust, or there's a probability of the bank going bust, because I think we're only in inning 4 or 5 of this banking crisis. Mm. So once we're in inning 9, if we have like a GFC type of deal, they're going to say, hey, do you really want to risk having your money in a bank that can go bust? Mm. Well, why not just take it over to the Fed? You get 5.25%, plus we'll throw in some UBI, or what, you know, to your point, we'll throw in some quote unquote free money. And then you get all these features, and people are going to use it. It's going to be a no-brainer. And then they're hooked on the network. And to help understand how powerful a network is, or the network effect, I always use the example of a cell phone, right? So I'm sure every single one of your viewers right now, they have an iPhone or some sort of smartphone, and they're on Instagram, they're on YouTube, or whatever, or the internet for that matter. Okay. Just let's assume that tomorrow, everything that you do using your phone will be used to create a social score, and that will be used against you. Would you continue to use your phone, yes or no? So I guarantee you that 99.9% of the people are going to say yes, if they're honest with themselves.
If they're honest, yeah.
That's the power of a network, and that's what we're up against.
Well, it already exists, though. But like, Facebook's been collecting data on people for years, and they still freely give away their information on it.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain degree, we all do. Yeah. I mean, you and I are on YouTube. I mean, we try to limit it to the best of our ability. But at the end of the day...
that's how you reach people.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it's ironic, isn't it? That the way that you impact or affect change is by playing their rules, or playing their game, if you will.
To the guys, last point of the question, what's a percentage of your net worth is in metals, cash, crypto?
Yeah, so I have a couple different portfolios, and that's just a very recent thing. Usually I've just had a long-term portfolio, and I set it up in a way that I call 10-80-10. So 10% would be insurance. For me, that's physical gold. I don't care what the price is doing. It's just, I'm not owning it to get rich. I'm just owning it for that insurance policy. Then 80% of it would be investments, and I like things that pay me to own them. So as an example, I bought a lot of commodity producers back in March of 2020, and then you just collect that dividend until the price of oil gets high, and then maybe you sell it, rotate into something else. When I first got into investing, when I retired in 2012, I went into real estate. It was a good time to do that. And I went in, not necessarily because I thought the prices were going to rebound or go back up to where they were today. I never could have dreamed that. But at the time, the cash flow was a very good deal relative to what else was out there. The cash flow is very cheap. So that would be an example. Then the other 10% would be speculative assets. So for me, something like gold miners, something like uranium, something like Bitcoin would fall into that category. Now, I know a lot of your viewers are going to say, oh, Bitcoin's not speculative asset, blah, blah, blah. It's a long-term investment. Yeah, that's fine. But right now, it's still in the speculative phase. I mean, you've got something that's moving 10% up or down every hour. That is a speculative asset, especially in the short term. And I hope it does great. I hope they're able to build out this ecosystem that allows us to transact as much as possible away from the government and the central planners and the authoritarians. But right now, we're just not yet at that stage. So that's kind of how I like to set up the portfolio. The new portfolio that I have is much more trading focused and much more short term, where it's not about just setting up a 10-year portfolio and then just not paying attention to it. It's more so, how am I making money month by month?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Instagram earlier. I think you got deplatformed from it recently. Was it?
Yeah, I could not believe that. Well, I've been kicked off YouTube, and then I've been kicked off Twitter, although that was from people just hacking into my account.
Yeah.
And then Twitter just not caring about it. And then more recently, I got kicked off of Instagram, and that was a real head scratcher because I don't post any of the freedom, liberty, free market capitalism stuff on Instagram. It's more so just a personal thing to, every once in a while I'll take a picture of me playing golf with Michael Chandler or out with Kenny or something like that. It's the most benign.
Did they give you a reason? Did you get it back, or is it just wiped clean now?
No, they gave it back to me.
Oh, they did?
I did. They sent me a thing to appeal, and I appealed it. And then a couple days later, they put it back up.
Did they give you a reason why it was shut down? Or, oops, sorry, our algorithms picked it up by accident?
They didn't even do that. I didn't get an email or anything. It just, I clicked on it one day and it was back.
Wow. Interesting. You've been talking for a while about the market correcting. One of the interesting conversations I think we had last time was you mentioned something like it was 9, 10, or 11 times that they've started to reduce rates, that the market corrects and goes south as well. They've been talking about reducing the rates. Where are we at right now? Like, what do you think the status is of that cycle?
So we have to look at the yield curve, and right now Fed funds, the overnight rate is at 5.25%. Now, Jerome Powell is coming out and starting to speak a little more dovish, as they say. He's committed to doing 3 rate cuts over the span of 2024, but he's not saying when. He's saying it's dependent on the labor market and a lot of other things. But the 10-year Treasury yield is right around 4.1, maybe 4.2 the last time I checked. So the 10-year Treasury is literally 100 basis points under the overnight rate. That is not normal.
What does that mean?
That means the market, because Rich, if I were to lend you, or if you were to lend me, let's say, $100,000 for the next 30 days, the probability of me paying you back and the probability of you taking inflation risk is low. But if I say, Rich, I need that $100,000 for 30 years, well, you're going to charge me a much higher interest rate because you have more inflation risk and you have more credit risk. From a standpoint of 30 years, who knows? Who knows where I'll be, what I'll be doing, and therefore you have to be compensated for that. That's why when you look at interest rates throughout history, the shorter term interest rates are lower than the longer term interest rates. And so if you see the opposite, where short term interest rates are much higher than long term interest rates, that's the market telling you something is fundamentally wrong with the economy. And the reason that happens, Rich, in my view, is because of insider information. So I know just from watching your content that prior to doing YouTube, you were an entrepreneur for many, many years. And I won't go into the business that you were in. I don't know if you share that information.
That's public.
But, okay. So you were in the credit business, right? And helping people improve their credit scores. So if I were to go to Rich Cooper, I would get some insider information as to what is happening with the consumer. Are they defaulting? Are they having more problems paying back their debt? What's happening with the overall credit scores? Or you would definitely have your finger on the pulse. So you've got to look at the George Soros, the Stan Druckenmiller, the Warren Buffetts, the Paul Tudor Jones. I call them the financial insider, the Larry Finks.
It's like the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, the same way that you had all that insider intel for what was happening with consumer credit, they have that insider intel as to what's happening with the global banking system, which has the insider intel as to what's happening with all the global corporations. You see? So they're getting this in real time, and the market doesn't have access to this. So if they are getting bad news, bad economic news from all of these multinational corporations, what are they going to do? They're going to buy U.S. Treasuries because it's the safest and it's the most liquid asset available. And they're going to want to get the most bang for their buck. So they're going to take as much duration risk, is what we call it, as possible. And that means buying 10-year and 30-year Treasuries. That creates more demand. That means the price goes up, the yield goes down. And this usually happens at the same time when the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates. And that's where you get the inversion of the curve. And that's my answer as to why the yield curve has almost a 100% predictive power. If you go back to the 1950s, the yield curve inversion has preceded every single recession that we have had. Now, it had a false positive once in the 1960s, but economic growth slowed substantially during that time frame. So, and the curve wasn't that inverted. If you look at the dynamics in addition to the curve, now I would argue that we've never been in this place before and not had a quote unquote hard landing. I'd also point out that the UK is in a technical recession, Germany in a technical recession, Japan basically in a technical recession, China is experiencing deflation for the first time in 30 years. So to have all of these global economies really struggling and somehow have the United States economy running on all 8 cylinders, I think the probability of that is extremely low if you look out over the next 12 months, but it can take a lot of time, Rich. That's the bottom line. And in the interim, when the curve is inverted, ironically, the market usually goes up. And it's when the curve starts to uninvert by the Fed dropping rates because the shit's hitting the fan, that's when you start to see the decline. So I'm not saying that the market's going to crash tomorrow, but I am saying if you're a prudent investor, you need to be cognizant of these risks, and you need to be managing your downside.
So the leading indicator where they're talking about a few rate cuts this year, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be more than just a few, really.
Yeah, so people look at this as something that's bullish. Like, oh my gosh, the Fed's going to drop rates, and that means the market's going to scream higher. But what they forget is why the Fed would be dropping rates. We have to realize that 5.25%, although for a lot of people in markets right now, you know, the younger people, they think those are really, really high interest rates. But Rich, you and I know for sure those aren't high.
I remember
those
my
are
dad complaining about
average.
almost 20% in the early 80s.
Yeah, but you can take it all the way back to the 1800s.
Yeah.
And that isn't really high. That's about average. So if we have the economy running on all 8 cylinders, like the central planners would have you believe, then why would they be lowering rates? That doesn't make any sense to me. And if you say, well, inflation is coming back down to their 2% target, well, fine, great. So what? We still just want quote unquote normal interest rates. And again, the curve is telling you that the Fed is going to be dropping rates, not because we have a no landing, but because we have a hard landing. So you go back in time and look at all these uninversions due to what we call a bull steepener, which is the front end coming back down lower than the long end. 100% of the time, it's a result of the Federal Reserve responding to a recession. We've never seen a time when they've actually responded ahead of time to avoid a recession once you have the curve inverted to this degree.
Does the upcoming election play into this at all?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's a cross current that you have to consider. And the Fed is obviously a political creature, a political entity. Now, I don't know how Jerome Powell sees Joe Biden or vice versa, but I can assure you Joe Biden will likely be breathing down his neck and saying, hey, you know, drop rates or do whatever you can that is quote unquote friendly to the market so I can get reelected. But then you have to ask yourself, is the Fed at the end of the day more powerful than the market itself? And over the short term, maybe. Over the longer midterm, no chance. And if you think the Fed can just come out with quantitative easing or drop rates back down to zero, and it's all rainbows, unicorns, and sunshine, I would suggest going back to March of 2020, when the Fed had to have an emergency meeting. And they were supposed to meet on a Wednesday. They met on a Sunday, and they dropped rates down to zero. They committed to over $1 trillion a day in repo, and they basically announced QE infinity. And the very next day, the market was down by roughly 1,500 points, and the market continued to tank, Rich, until the government came out and said that they were going to do all this fiscal spending in the form of the CARES Act. That's when the market started to have that V-shaped recovery and go back up. So yes, there is a Fed put, but at a certain point, the market forces are going to overwhelm anything the Fed does.
It seems like it's not a question of if, it's just a matter of when this correction is going to happen and how hard or how soft it's going to be. But based on the indicators that you're looking at, have you started to move out of positions from the market into stuff that's more stable? Are you moving more into cash or?
Yeah, but I mean, I did it way too early. And I'll be the first person to admit that it was way early. Timing these things is very, very difficult. And then it goes back to what your objectives are, right? If your objectives, like guys, well, I think you're a perfect example, and I throw myself in that same category. Your main objective right now is just don't lose any of your purchasing power. Like, just, I'm at a very good place. Let's, at the very least, let's maintain that. Yeah. If I can get a 10 or 15% return over the long run,
playing not to lose.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. In life, I think it should be the opposite.
Playing to win.
I think you should be playing
especially
to win.
When you're younger. Yeah.
Yeah. And even now, for guys like you and I think you should play to win, but in just different areas.
Yeah.
When you're looking at your ability to maintain your lifestyle, especially at our age, I think and especially based on what we've achieved, it's a different dynamic. So if I'm looking at it, through that lens, I would much prefer to err on the side of caution. And that's exactly what I've done. So the way I've been playing this is I'm just sitting with the majority of my portfolio in gold and T-bills, and 90% T-bills, and just being paid 5.5% roughly on those. And then just having
physical gold or gold miners or?
Well, with that, it's a combination of physical and the Sprott Trust. Okay. And I'd prefer that it's all physical, but with my living situation, that's very difficult to do. So it's a combination of that and the Sprott Trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I'm sitting back playing the yield curve. And then once it uninverts, the probability is high that I give an opportunity to go in there and buy something cheap. And that's when I take that dry powder that's currently earning 5.5%, turn that into dollars, take those dollars, and then buy the hard assets that hopefully are paying me to own them, that I want to hold on to for the long run.
So the New York Stock Exchange is at, let's see if we can find a chart here right now. Chart, composite data news.
While you're doing that, if I'm a young guy though, that just has, let's say 20 or 30,000, and I've got a decent job, and I'm just starting off in life, or I'm starting out in life, and my objective is to get to the Rich Cooper level or the George Gammon level as soon as I can, then it's a completely different strategy. Then what I'm doing is I'm realizing that we're going into a cycle of massive volatility.
Mm-hmm.
And I would probably be obviously much more short term, but I'd be long like NVIDIA or something like that, or I'd be long Bitcoin, but I would do that and I'd be hyper focused on my stops.
NVIDIA is at the point now where grandparents are talking about it. And usually when your grandparents start talking about stocks, it's like, okay, it's time to sell.
Yeah. I mean, look, on one hand, I completely agree and you're spot on. On the other hand, if I'm 25 years old and I've got a decent job, and I got 25, I'm potentially taking a flyer, but don't get me wrong, Rich, I'm not just YOLOing it.
Mm-hmm.
What I would do is I would set up that trade to make sure that I'm limiting my downside in case I get the timing wrong. And then I've got asymmetry in the trade. So as an example, I would do like what they call a vertical spread with options. So if I'm right over the next month, then I make X amount. But if I'm wrong, I define how much I lose as far as a percentage of my portfolio. Where what most people do is they just say, oh, I like NVIDIA, I'm going to go long. And then they just sit there and hope and pray. And what ends up happening is they do the opposite of what you should do. They cut their winners short and they ride their losers, right? Because let's say you get into that NVIDIA position at 1,000, you think it's going to 1,300 over the next month, and it starts to go against them. Well, they'll sit there and say, oh, I don't want to cut my position. I'm just going to wait until it comes back up to 1,000, and then I'm going to sell so I don't have to realize that loss.
Mm-hmm.
Or what they do is it starts to go in their favor and it goes up to, let's say, 1,050 or 1,100. And they say, oh my gosh, I've already made $5,000. I don't want to jeopardize, this capital gain that I've had. So I'm going to go ahead and sell right now. Where if you look at the pros, they do the complete opposite. They cut their winners almost immediately, but they cut their losers almost immediately, but they let their winners ride.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There was a book that talked about that. I can't remember what it was called. I read it like 25 years ago.
It's every single trading book that has ever been written by anyone credible.
Yeah, basically.
and if your viewers want some suggestions, read the Market Wizards books. It's one of the reasons why with my new setup here, I put books right up there. And one of them is, the first one's Beat the Dealer. That teaches you about probabilities. But then the next one is Market Wizards by Jack Schwager. He has 3 or 4 editions of that, and I can't suggest them enough, especially for the young guys who want to maybe take a little bit more risk. Jack Schwager.
Jack? How do you spell Schwager?
SCHWAGER.
Okay. So the current New York Stock Exchange composite is at 18,114. When we had the scamdemic a number of years ago, it dropped to the 9,000s. What sort of correction are you anticipating for this landing?
That's all.
Do you think it could be as strong as the 9,000 range that we saw with the scamdemic?
Absolutely, and it could also be zero. I mean, the market could go up. That's why so many people on my channel, I talk about the economy going into a recession. That's something that I can predict with much more confidence. Mm. But they say, okay, George, if the economy is going into a recession, then that's going to be negative for the stock market. Mm. And therefore, let's go out and short the S&P 500. Let's buy puts on the S&P 500, basically benefiting if the market goes down. And I always say, look, I can't give you personal investing advice, but me personally, I wouldn't do that. Mm. Why? Because you never know what the central planners are going to do, for heaven's sakes. It is true that the market's going to overwhelm them, but maybe the recession isn't bad enough for whatever the response is to actually take hold. I mean, they could come out with like the Bank of Japan and buy equities, for heaven's sakes. The Bank of Japan owns like 60% of the outstanding sovereign debt. I mean, they've done crazy, crazy things. So why the United States wouldn't follow that path just to avoid any financial pain? I mean, you got me. I think that would be the path of least resistance. So that's what I would expect. So the way I prefer to play a recession is going long the 2-year Treasury, because the 2-year Treasury is pretty much tied at the hip to the Federal Reserve overnight interest rate. So assuming that we have a recession, the Feds drop rates, which is almost definitely what they would do, then you're going to benefit by the decrease in yield or the increase in price of that 2-year Treasury.
So I got, I mentioned this last time we did a show, but I got a good friend of mine that's a money manager. So he's Anon. He has a question for you because he likes to challenge your takes on certain things. So last spoke July 2023, he said that you thought the market was in trouble, and within 12 to 16 months, so this was last summer, within 12 to 16 months, it's been 8 months and it's up 20% since then. Does he still think July to December 2024 is the fall?
I mean, again, as far as timing, it's almost impossible to know. I mean, he's what he's insinuating is spot on. This inversion of the curve has been incredibly long. In fact, I think we may be at the point right now where it's even longer than what we saw 2006, 2007 that preceded the GFC. So let's go into why George Gammon would be wrong. And when I would even come on my channel, this is not about ego. I'm happy to admit if I'm wrong, but I can quantify that pretty easily. So if we see, again, the overnight rate, let's say is here, the 10-year treasury is here. If we see an uninversion by what they call a bear steepener, so that means the long end of the curve going up instead of a bull steepener, which would be the short end or the front end of the curve going down. And if we see that sustained, then I'll be the first person to admit that I was wrong. And this time is absolutely different. And then I would have to figure out mechanically why. What happened that made this time different than pretty much every other time going back to the 1950s. But to his specific point, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. I don't even know if the market would crash. And again, I think a much better way to play a hard landing is the 2-year treasury or the curve inverting due to a bull steepener. Because regardless of what happens with the stock market, if they're trying to prevent a recession in the real economy, almost for sure, and again, there are no certainties, only probabilities, but like a 99% probability that they would drop rates, in which case the price of the 2-year treasury is going to go up.
And he's got a follow-up to it. He says, if the Fed starts to cut interest rates and 30-year mortgage rates get down to 5%-ish, does he think real estate in the U.S. will take off again?
Well, so you got to ask yourself, why would they cut rates? So in the past, every single time they've cut rates was due to the shit hitting the fan.
Right.
So let's just assume that mortgage rates go from, I don't know what they are now. Let's just say they're 7%. Let's say they go down to 5% or 4%. Okay, but the unemployment rate in that environment is going from 4% up to 8% or 10%. So, and then lending standards are going to get far tighter. So yes, rates are going down, but is that a net positive for the real estate market? Probably not. And I'd go back to the GFC. I mean, look, we had rates plummet in 2009, 2010, but what happened to the housing market? It went straight down until it bottomed out in August of 2012. So just because we have low rates, that isn't necessarily bullish. In fact, low rates are usually an indicator that the economy is unhealthy, and is often an indicator that although money's cheap, money's tight. And most people think that low interest rates equal money being loose, and that's not the case.
Got a friend here in the super chat asking about the rain tax in Canada. I think that's a Toronto mayoral tax that was introduced. Apparently,
I haven't heard about that.
Enough, I might bodge this up. Somebody in the chat or the comments can correct me afterwards. But apparently, if you don't have enough lawn on your property, then there's a tax because of runoff or like rain runoff or something like. I don't know. They keep making up these new taxes to live in Toronto, and I don't know why people live in a big city anymore. It's just absurd to deal with all these inconveniences and tax rates with less freedom and more wokeness and rainbows shoved down your throat.
Yeah, but again, I think that's a great reason why everyone should have a line in the sand.
Yeah.
And it should be very defined. And everyone's line in the sand is going to be different. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong.
It's the whole boil the frog slowly, though, right? Like everybody says they've got a line in the sand, but it's like, okay, take one step back, another step back, and you keep walking backwards over the line in the sand very, very slowly. You don't.
That's my point.
You keep moving the line, right?
But that's my point. Yeah. But if you don't have a line to begin with, there's no way that you can avoid being that frog.
Yeah.
So you've not only got to have a line, but then you have to be disciplined enough to execute your game plan when and if the government crosses that line.
Got a little bit of time left. You've got the Rebel Capitalist event coming up in May, June. It's coming up very quickly. You invited me as a guest, so I've got a speaking slot there.
Yeah.
Can you tell everybody what's happening at the event? Is there a link that they can go to buy a ticket that you can mention and give them some insight on what's going to happen there?
Yeah, thanks for letting me plug it, Rich.
Yeah.
It's rebelcapitalslive.com, and they can see past speakers. We've been doing this now for about 3 years, and they can see the speaker lineup that we have for this year. It's I try to bring a diverse group of guys and gals that I like talking to. And so it's got components of real estate, gold, crypto, the stock market, macroeconomics. We've got guys like Jeff Snyder, Mike Green there. But then we also have guys like Kenny McElroy. Kiyosaki stops by every once in a while. And we've got guys that are in the Plan B space, freedom and liberty, like my good friend Robert Barnes.
I want to hear about that, yeah.
Yeah, he's a constitutional lawyer that represents Alex Jones and a lot of his, let's say, adventures.
Yeah.
And and then we've got Mark Moss, a good buddy of mine, who's he's a good macro guy, but he kind of is in the Bitcoin space. I think you'd call him maybe a maxi. And so we're bringing all these incredible people together. The one common denominator we all have is we are hardcore proponents of freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. So if you want to be a part of that group, you can just check it out at rebelcapitalslive.com.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to tailor my talk to that theme. So I'll be mindful of that when I put it all together. Yeah, so grab a ticket, guys. I'll be there. Is Robert Kiyosaki going to be there this year? You said he might stop by?
Yeah, so Robert, I'm very good friends with Robert, and he knows he has an open invitation to anything I do. And so although he's not scheduled to be a speaker, it's not unlike Robert to text me a couple days prior and say, hey, I'm going to be there and I want to talk about X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, we'll make it happen. So we have some VIP guests that are coming. We've got the Uneducated Economist, who's great on YouTube. We've got Viva Fry, who's partners with Barnes and kind of that freedom and liberty space. He was up in Canada, and then he got the hell out of Dodge and went down to Florida.
Recently,
yeah. So a lot of just super, super cool people. But the main benefit is just rubbing elbows with people that share your worldview, and I call them rebel capitalists.
I'm gonna message Robert. I got his number. I'm gonna ask him if he's coming because I'd like to meet him. Yeah. Good show, George. Yeah, appreciate you popping in, saying hi, and sharing some wisdom, with our followers. Thanks for all the super chats and, the gratitude. Go check out George's channel, Rebel Capitalist channel, and at George Gammon. I've tagged it in the title. He's got loads, and there's more content than you can consume there. And I definitely want to hear about your road trip, the CBDC challenge, the gold, silver, Bitcoin sort of road trip, to see how that unfolds. I'll be watching and looking forward to hearing the updates on that. So thanks.
Yeah, we'll be live streaming it on the Rebel Capitalist channel from the road. So I'm sure we'll go through a lot of fun times, a lot of trials and tribulations, and at the very least, it'll be an incredible adventure that we can share with everyone, and again, help them prepare for what I think is coming.
Yeah, enjoy that road trip. Are you still into the diesel trucks or the supercars, or what are you doing car wise these days? Because I know that you're a bit of a petrol head.
Yeah, so that's the one drawback to Medellin. The gals are great, the cost of living, the weather, everything. Yeah. But they don't really have highways here, and they definitely don't have any roads where you could drive like a McLaren. I had one last time I was in the States, so I kind of reserve that for when I go back to the USA, temporarily, or I'm spending time in Europe or something like that. But what I have done to scratch the itch down in Medellin is a couple of different things. I bought an FJ Cruiser the other day, which I absolutely love. I didn't know if I'd like it, but now that I have it and I've taken it off-roading and I take it to some of the towns in the exterior and the countryside,
capable.
It's one of my favorite cars I've ever had. It's so cool, so awesome. And then as far as the speed, they are setting up a track here in Medellin, and they do have a track up in Bogota. where you can kind of run the quarter mile on Friday night, Saturday night, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I bought a 2014 E63, and then what I did is I had it tuned.
Mm.
And I didn't know how that would work, but as you know, that car has a lot of capacity in those
turbo V8, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
but
you can get 700-800 horsepower easily out of that.
Exactly. So stock, it comes 550, and usually when you do a tune, it only adds about 25 or 50 horsepower, but there's so much capacity, they're not using those turbochargers. If you get a good tuner, to your point, they can really ramp up the horsepower, and he got it up to about 700. Yeah. And I've had, the Lambos, I've had the Ferraris, I've had the McLarens, and this thing in a straight line, I would argue, is probably faster than all of it. It's basically like a German Hellcat. So that's what I'm doing right now as far as vehicles.
Awesome. All right, man. Well, appreciate you stopping by and saying hi. Guys, go check out George's stuff. I'll definitely have him on in the future. And if you're at the Rebel Capitalist event coming up, I'll see you guys there because I'll be there. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Rich.